It was late October of 2023, back when my neighborhood had already lost most of its Halloween spirit. I'd lived in the same small rental house since 2016, tucked inside a quiet suburban block lined with maple trees and aging streetlights. When I first moved there, Halloween used to feel alive. Families filled the sidewalks, porches glowed orange, and kids sprinted door to door with pillowcases full of candy. But after the pandemic years, everything changed. Each October afterward felt emptier than the last. Decorations disappeared. Houses stayed dark. Parents stopped taking their kids out. By 2023, Halloween night felt more like an abandoned holiday than a celebration. That morning, I brewed coffee and stepped out onto my porch to enjoy the cold air and the orange leaves scattered across the yard. The second I opened the front door, though, I noticed two figures standing near the edge of my property beneath the trees. At first, I thought they were teenagers. Both wore expressionless white masks and dark hoodies, standing completely still beside the fence line. They were tall though, too tall to be middle school kids, and unusually thin. The moment they saw me, they exchanged a glance and quickly disappeared deeper between the trees bordering the road. It instantly gave me a bad feeling. Not because it was Halloween. Just because of how fast they left. It looked exactly like the reaction of people who'd been caught doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. Still, I convinced myself it was harmless. Probably just older kids trying to scare people early for fun. I sat outside anyway, drinking coffee while cold wind carried leaves across the driveway. Eventually I forgot about them entirely. The rest of the day felt normal. Around 4 in the afternoon, I dumped a small bowl of candy onto the coffee table mostly out of habit. Even though nobody trick-or-treated anymore, I still bought candy every year. It felt wrong not to. I spent the evening on the couch watching old horror movies with the curtains open so I could see if anyone walked by outside. No one ever did. By 7:30, the neighborhood looked dead. Dark houses. Empty sidewalks. No costumes. No laughter. Only the occasional car passing through the street. Around 8, 3 loud knocks suddenly hit the front door. The sound startled me enough that I nearly dropped the remote. I grabbed the candy bowl and walked over, expecting maybe a few late trick-or-treaters. When I opened the door, my stomach immediately tightened. It was the same 2 masked figures from that morning. Now that they were close, they looked even stranger. Both wore black gloves and dark clothing from head to toe. Their masks were blank and dirty looking, almost homemade. Neither carried candy bags. Neither spoke. They just stood there silently staring into the house. I forced an awkward smile and held out the bowl. "Want some candy?" Nothing. No movement. No response. Just silence. The longer they stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. Finally, I stepped backward and shut the door. At first I laughed nervously to myself, trying to shake it off. Some weird prank. Some TikTok challenge maybe. Teenagers trying to freak people out on Halloween. After about a minute, I peeked back outside. They were gone. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. That should have been the end of it. Instead, things got worse. I stayed downstairs until after midnight watching television. Eventually I turned everything off and headed upstairs to bed. By then, I hadn't thought about the masked strangers for hours. I fell asleep almost immediately. Then, bang! 3 heavy knocks echoed through the house. I woke instantly. Another knock rattled the front door downstairs. My chest tightened as I checked my phone. 2:11 a.m. I crept into the hallway and listened. Knock. 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 Slow. Deliberate. I moved quietly downstairs, every light in the house still off. The living room windows reflected darkness back at me as I approached the front entryway. Carefully, I leaned toward the peephole. One person stood outside. Only one. The same blank mask. The same black hoodie. He stood inches from the door knocking softly over and over again. But the second thing I noticed terrified me more. Where was the other one? I backed away from the door, trying to think clearly. That's when I heard a sound behind me. A faint creak. Like a door slowly opening somewhere inside the house. I turned toward the hallway. At the far end of it, near the kitchen entrance, stood a dark figure. Before I could even react, he sprinted toward me holding something metallic in his hand. A knife. I ran. I bolted upstairs so fast I nearly slipped. The footsteps thundered behind me while the masked man downstairs continued pounding on the front door like a distraction. I made it into my bedroom, slammed the door shut, and shoved my dresser against it while dialing 911 with shaking hands. Outside the room, I could hear muffled voices. Two men talking quietly back and forth. Then footsteps moved down the stairs. A moment later, the house went silent again. By the time police arrived, both intruders were gone. Officers searched the property and found signs that someone had forced open a small basement window earlier that night. They believed one of the masked men distracted me at the front door while the other entered through the back side of the house. But they never found out who they were. No fingerprints. No cameras. No vehicle. Nothing. The part that still bothers me most is how planned it felt. They'd been watching the house since morning. Watching me. Waiting until the neighborhood was completely silent. And every Halloween since then, I leave all the lights off and pretend nobody's home. Because sometimes late at night, when the wind hits the porch just right, I still think I hear knocking downstairs. Near the end of November 2022, I decided to take one final camping trip before winter fully settled in. There's a huge stretch of forest about an hour outside my town filled with old backpacking trails and forgotten campsites. I'd been hiking there for years and usually avoided the crowded campgrounds. I preferred isolated spots deep in the woods where nobody else ever wandered. The colder it got outside, the fewer people showed up. That was exactly why I liked it. That afternoon, I parked at an empty trailhead beneath gray skies and started hiking. Dead leaves covered the ground, crunching beneath my boots while cold wind pushed through the bare trees overhead. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No hikers. No voices. No birds. Nothing. After about 7 miles, I reached a small clearing just off the trail that looked familiar. I'd camped there once years earlier beside a cluster of fallen logs. I set up my tent while daylight slowly faded from the forest. The cold hit harder than I expected that evening. Even sitting beside the campfire in gloves and a winter jacket, I could still feel freezing wind slipping through the trees. That's when I started noticing movement. Far back in the woods. At first I thought it was deer. But every time I looked directly toward it, whatever I saw stopped moving. Then a few minutes later, movement again. Always distant. Always just outside the firelight. I tried convincing myself I was imagining things. The problem was the feeling never went away. It felt like someone was watching me. Night came fast. Eventually I crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag, leaving the front flap partially open so I could still see the campfire glowing outside. For a while, everything stayed quiet except the crackling flames and wind. Hours passed. Then I heard footsteps. Crunch. 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 Behind the tent. Slow footsteps circling through dead leaves. I froze instantly. The sound moved closer until it stopped only a few feet away. I held my breath, staring at the tent wall. Silence. Complete silence. After nearly a minute, panic finally took over. I grabbed my flashlight and burst out of the tent, swinging the beam wildly toward the trees behind me. Nothing. Nobody there. No movement. No sound. That somehow scared me even more. I packed immediately. The entire time I shoved gear into my backpack, I kept spinning around convinced someone stood just beyond the darkness. Then suddenly, footsteps exploded behind the tent. Fast. Running. I caught a glimpse of someone darting between trees. That was enough. I threw my backpack over my shoulders and backed away from the campsite. Before I could leave, a man stepped directly into the firelight. He looked filthy. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Wearing torn jeans and an old dark jacket with a knit cap pulled low over his face. His eyes looked empty. Like he hadn't slept in days. "You shouldn't be out here tonight," he said calmly. I didn't answer. I just kept backing away. The man tilted his head slightly, studying me. Too cold to be wandering around in the dark. Something about the way he said it made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. So I did. I turned and sprinted straight into the woods. Behind me, I heard him crashing through leaves giving chase. Branches whipped across my face while I stumbled blindly between trees. I couldn't even tell if I was moving toward the trail anymore. After maybe 30 seconds, the footsteps behind me stopped. But I didn't stop running. Eventually I collapsed beside a tree somewhere deep in the darkness, completely lost. I stayed there for hours shivering in silence. Twice during the night, I heard distant movement between the trees nearby. Slow footsteps. Circling. Searching. I stayed perfectly still until sunrise finally broke through the forest. When daylight came, I managed to find the trail and hike back out. I never returned to that forest again. But what scares me most is realizing that man had probably been watching me long before I ever noticed him. Waiting. Studying me. Seeing how alone I really was. Last October, my younger sister flew out of state for a Halloween festival with some friends and asked if I could watch her dog for the weekend. Her German Shepherd, Ranger, was older and extremely calm, so I didn't mind helping. Since my apartment didn't allow pets, I stayed at her house instead. The place sat near the edge of a wooded neighborhood almost 30 minutes outside the city. Quiet area. Too quiet sometimes. My sister left early Friday morning, and after she drove away, I settled into the spare bedroom upstairs with my laptop to finish work for the day. Ranger curled up beside the desk almost immediately. Everything felt normal for the first few hours. Then sometime around noon, Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the hallway. His ears stood upright. He stared toward the bedroom doorway without moving. At first I ignored it. Dogs hear weird things all the time. But 10 minutes later, he was still staring. Completely focused. Eventually he stood up and slowly walked into the hallway. I followed him through the house, checking rooms, closets, and doors. Nothing was there. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with me. The rest of the afternoon, Ranger kept reacting to things I couldn't hear. Tiny sounds maybe. Floor creaks. Movement outside. Every single time, he'd stare toward the hallway or the back door like someone stood there watching us. Around sunset, I clipped on his leash and took him for a walk along the wooded trail behind the neighborhood. The forest looked dead that time of year. Bare branches. Gray sky. Leaves crunching beneath our feet. We'd walked maybe 10 minutes down the trail when Ranger suddenly stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped completely. He stared farther down the path into the trees ahead. I looked too but saw absolutely nothing. "Come on," I whispered, gently tugging the leash. He wouldn't move. His tail lowered slightly while he kept staring into the woods. I don't know why, but fear suddenly hit me hard. I turned around and headed back. The moment I did, Ranger immediately followed beside me without hesitation. The entire walk home, he kept looking behind us. That night after dinner, I called my sister and asked if Ranger had been acting strange lately. She laughed it off and said he was probably reacting to wildlife. I wanted to believe that. Later that evening, while sitting upstairs watching videos on my laptop, I thought I saw movement outside the spare bedroom window. A person. Just for a second. Someone moving past the side of the house. But when I looked again, nothing was there. By midnight, I finally decided to get ready for bed. Before sleeping, I let Ranger outside one last time into the backyard. The cold air hit instantly as I opened the back door. Ranger walked halfway across the yard, then suddenly froze near the tree line. He wasn't looking at the woods. He was staring toward the side of the house. I leaned slightly out the doorway to see what he saw. That's when a man sprinted directly toward me from the darkness. I stumbled backward in shock. Ranger exploded into barking and charged at him full speed. The man panicked instantly. He tried dodging the dog while backing away toward the fence. Ranger stopped just short of attacking him, barking violently while standing between me and the stranger. I slammed the back door shut and locked it. Seconds later, the yard was silent again. The man had vanished. Police searched the property later that night but found nothing useful. What disturbed me most came afterward. While checking the house, I realized the back door lock was broken. It looked locked. But it actually wasn't. Anyone outside could have opened it. And suddenly Ranger's behavior all day made terrifying sense. The staring. The anxiety. The refusal to continue down the trail. He knew someone was nearby long before I did. Sometimes I wonder if the man had been watching the house the entire day waiting for the right moment to get inside. If Ranger hadn't been there, I honestly don't know what would have happened to me that night. The first winter after I moved into the house felt wrong from the beginning. I had relocated to a quiet neighborhood outside a small mountain town, a place I barely knew outside of a few quick visits before signing the paperwork. During those visits, the streets seemed calm and almost unnaturally empty. People stayed indoors. Curtains remained closed. Even on moving day, while I hauled boxes from the truck for hours, not a single neighbor introduced themselves. At first, I appreciated it. I've always been the kind of person who keeps to themselves. But after that first week, the silence around the neighborhood started to feel less peaceful and more unsettling. The strange incident started 2 nights after I moved in. I was still unpacking, surrounded by towers of boxes and half-built furniture. Snow had been falling non-stop since noon, coating the entire street in thick white layers. By evening I was exhausted and fell asleep around 8:30. At some point during the night, I woke abruptly. The room was dark. The digital clock beside my bed read 2:13 a.m. That's when I heard it. Scrape. Thunk. Scrape. Thunk. At first I thought the sound was part of a dream, but it continued steadily outside. Curious, I got out of bed and walked to the window overlooking the driveway. A man was out there shoveling snow. He wore a dark winter coat with the hood pulled tightly over his head. Snowflakes drifted around him as he slowly dragged the shovel across the pavement. His movements looked stiff and mechanical, almost unnatural. I stood there watching for several minutes. The entire thing gave me an awful feeling. It wasn't just the fact that someone was outside my house at 2 in the morning. It was the way he moved, slow, repetitive, completely silent except for the scraping of metal on concrete. Eventually I decided to go downstairs and confront him. But the second I stepped outside, the driveway was empty. Half the snow had been cleared, yet the man was nowhere in sight. The street was completely silent. No footprints leading away. No nearby cars. No lights on in neighboring homes. Just the cold wind and the unfinished path carved through the snow. The next morning I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was some local trying to help new residents. Maybe he'd gotten embarrassed when he saw me coming outside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was wrong. The following night, I stayed awake later while organizing the kitchen. Around 11, I finally went to bed. Then, once again, I woke up a little after 2. Scrape. Thunk. Scrape. Thunk. I rushed to the window. The same man was out there. This time I ran downstairs immediately, barely stopping to throw on my boots. I yanked open the front door. And again, he was gone. Not walking away. Not at the end of the driveway. Gone. Over the next several nights, the exact same thing happened. Every night around 2 in the morning, I'd wake to the sound of shoveling. Every night the man would appear in my driveway. And every time I tried to catch him, he vanished before I reached the door. By the 5th night, I had stopped trying to go outside. Instead, I watched from the upstairs window, feeling more disturbed each time I saw him. Something about the situation felt deeply wrong. Then came the night everything escalated. I woke up again to the familiar scraping noise, but this time it stopped suddenly before I reached the window. The silence hit instantly. I pulled the curtain aside. The driveway was completely cleared. No man in sight. I stared outside for several seconds, confused. There was no way he could have disappeared that quickly. A horrible feeling settled into my stomach. I hurried downstairs and opened the front door. The man was standing directly on my porch. So close I nearly stumbled backward. He gripped the shovel loosely in one hand. Up close, he looked even worse than I expected. Pale skin. Long wet hair hanging around his face. A tangled beard crusted with snow. His eyes looked exhausted and hollow, fixed directly on me without blinking. Neither of us spoke. For several seconds he simply stared. Finally I forced myself to ask what he wanted. His expression tightened slightly, almost irritated that I'd spoken at all. Without answering, he turned and walked down the porch steps. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching him disappear down the road into the darkness. I barely slept that night. The following day was strangely calm. No snowfall. No sounds outside. I spent most of the afternoon trying to convince myself the situation was over. That night, I woke again around 2. But there was no scraping sound. The silence was somehow worse. I lay there trying to fall asleep when I heard a soft thud downstairs. It was faint, but unmistakable. I got out of bed and slowly walked downstairs. The hallway was dark. As I reached the bottom step, I noticed something standing in the living room. A figure. Motionless. The man stood in the center of the room with his back facing me, still holding the shovel at his side. He wasn't moving. Wasn't speaking. Just standing there in complete darkness inside my house. I ran upstairs so fast I nearly fell. I locked myself in the bedroom and called 911 while trying to keep quiet enough not to let him know where I was. Police arrived within minutes. They found the rear door open. The man was gone. I gave them every detail I could remember, but nothing ever came from it. No suspect. No explanation. No neighbors recognized the description. One officer suggested the guy may have been mentally ill or sleepwalking because of the repetitive behavior. Maybe. But that explanation never sat right with me. Because somehow, every single night, he always knew the exact moment I left the upstairs window. And somehow, on the final night, He ended up inside my house before I even realized the door had been opened. I moved out before spring arrived. To this day, whenever snow falls late at night, I still wake up expecting to hear that slow scraping sound outside my window again. A year ago, I bought a tiny cabin deep in the woods after landing a remote job. It had always been my dream to live somewhere isolated. Housing prices were ridiculous anyway, and the cabin was cheap enough that I could actually afford it. The property sat miles from the nearest town, tucked beside dense forest and connected only by a narrow gravel road. The previous owner's son sold it to me after inheriting it from his parents. He claimed the place had been renovated recently and was perfectly safe year-round. The cabin itself looked old despite the updates. Heavy wood walls. A stone fireplace. Creaking floors. Still, I loved it immediately. On the evening I arrived, while unloading the last few bags from my SUV, I noticed someone approaching from the tree line. A man around his 40s waved as he walked toward me. He introduced himself as Darren and claimed he lived in another cabin nearby. He talked non-stop from the moment we met, smiling constantly in a way that felt just a little too forced. At first I figured he was simply excited to finally have another person living nearby. After 15 minutes of conversation, he asked if he could see the inside of the cabin. I hesitated, but eventually agreed since most of my belongings were still packed away. He wandered through every room slowly, asking strange questions about whether I lived alone and how long I planned to stay. By the time he finished, the sun had already gone down. I expected him to leave. Instead, he sat down on the couch and kept talking. I finally had to awkwardly tell him I wanted to settle in for the night. He laughed, apologized, and headed outside. At first I thought that would be the end of it. A couple hours later, I woke up from dozing on the couch beside the fireplace. The cabin was completely dark except for glowing embers in the fire. Then I heard footsteps outside. Soft crunching sounds circling the porch. I walked quietly to the front door and pulled back the curtain covering the small glass window. Darren stood inches away staring at the cabin. He visibly jumped when he saw me looking at him. Then he smiled again. "Oh, hey," he said. I was just about to knock. It was nearly 10 at night. I asked what he wanted. He claimed he was having a campfire near his cabin and wanted me to join him. Something about the invitation made my skin crawl. I asked where exactly his cabin was. He pointed toward a narrow trail disappearing into the black woods and said it was just down there. The forest beyond the porch looked completely pitch black. I politely refused. Instead of leaving, Darren glanced past me at the fireplace. "You already have a fire going," he said. "Maybe I'll just hang out here instead." That was the moment real fear kicked in. I firmly told him no and shut the curtain. For almost a full minute, I could still see his silhouette standing outside the door. Eventually he stepped off the porch and disappeared into the woods. I stood there trying to calm myself down. Then a gunshot echoed through the forest. The sound exploded through the trees so loudly it rattled the windows. My stomach dropped. The shot came from the exact direction Darren had walked. Before I could even process it, I saw movement rushing out of the darkness. Darren sprinted toward the cabin screaming for help. He burst through the open front door before I could react. He bent over in the hallway clutching his stomach, yelling that someone had shot him. But as he leaned forward, his jacket lifted slightly. I saw the handle of a revolver tucked into his waistband. My entire body went cold. Everything suddenly clicked into place at once. The fake friendliness. The pressure to follow him into the woods. The lingering outside my cabin. Without saying a word, I grabbed my car keys from the counter and bolted outside. He shouted after me, but didn't chase me. I drove straight toward town while calling the police. Officers later searched the cabin and found him still sitting calmly in the living room as if waiting for me to come back. The worst part was what they discovered afterward. There was no nearby cabin belonging to him. No records of anyone by that name living anywhere near the area. The revolver hidden under his jacket was loaded except for one missing bullet. Police believed the gunshot I heard had been fired by him intentionally to create panic and force his way inside my cabin. Had I followed him into those woods or let him stay inside with me alone, I honestly don't think I would have survived that night. I had only lived in the house for about 2 weeks when the smell started. The place wasn't great, but it was affordable, which mattered more to me at the time. I'd moved there after accepting a new job in a rougher part of town where cheap housing disappeared fast. At first, everything seemed normal. Then one evening after work, I walked inside and immediately gagged. The smell was horrible. Rotten. Sour. Almost chemical. I searched the entire house thinking maybe food had spoiled somewhere during the move, but I found nothing. Oddly enough, after a few hours, the odor faded away. The next night, it came back even stronger. This time I searched more carefully and discovered something strange. The sliding glass back door was unlocked. I knew I hadn't opened it since moving in. Beyond the yard sat a thick stretch of woods. At night, the trees formed a solid wall of darkness. I locked the door again and tried convincing myself I'd simply forgotten. Still, the situation bothered me enough that I stayed alert the rest of the night. Hours later, I finally fell asleep upstairs. Sometime during the night, I woke slowly to the sound of a loud grinding noise. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then the sound stopped. A steady dripping echoed through the house instead. Half asleep, I assumed I'd accidentally left the kitchen faucet running. I walked downstairs in darkness toward the kitchen. The dripping got louder. And so did that disgusting smell. I reached the sink and turned the faucet off. Then I noticed something stuffed deep into the drain. Even in the dark, I could tell it was flesh. Torn apart. Wet. Rotting. I stepped backward in horror. That's when I noticed the back door. Unlocked again. A realization hit me instantly. Someone had been inside my house moments earlier. Probably still was. Every instinct screamed at me not to turn the lights on. I slowly backed out of the kitchen and crept toward the stairs. The entire house had gone dead silent. Then suddenly, thump. Heavy footsteps exploded from the room beside the kitchen. I nearly screamed. The footsteps moved quickly across the floor. I heard someone struggling with something near the sink. A second later, the garbage disposal roared to life. I froze halfway up the stairs, barely breathing. After several seconds, the disposal shut off. Silence. Then I heard it. Breathing. A man breathing heavily somewhere below me in the dark kitchen. The footsteps moved again toward another room. I heard garbage bags rustling. Then the sliding door opened. Closed. Silence returned. I ran upstairs, locked myself in my bedroom, and called police. By the time officers arrived, the intruder had vanished into the woods behind the house. What investigators found in the plumbing made the entire situation even more disturbing. The man had apparently been forcing chunks of animal remains down my kitchen drain for days. Large pieces. Too large for normal disposal. Police believed he'd repeatedly broken into my home because he thought the property was vacant. But I never believed that explanation. My car sat outside every day. Lights were on every night. There were obvious signs someone lived there. To this day, I still think he chose my house intentionally. Whether he was trying to hide evidence, scare me away, or cover up something worse, I'll probably never know. But years later, I still wake up some nights convinced I can smell that same rotten odor drifting through the house again.